Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Conversations with Go On Girl. I'm Linda Johnson, co-founder and president of Go On Girl Book Club. 2021 marks our 30th year as an organization of members that read and support authors of the African diaspora. This series of conversations with authors, as well as people in the book publishing industry, from editors to Black booksellers, has been developed to connect us with the art of writing and the inner workings of the book publishing industry. Go On Girl Book Club is a literary sisterhood of dedicated women from 51 chapters in 16 states and 40 cities who read a variety of genres written by Black authors. Today and this entire month, our conversations focus on women for Women's History Month. Today, we have Mikki Taylor with her Audible original, A Force of Beauty. Your moderators today are Julia Chance from New York 1 and Daphne Pierre from New York 18. And to get you in the mood for today's discussion, here is an excerpt from the audiobook. Enjoy.
So get this, fur pelts, mink stoles, and fox wraps fly through the air and land on the ivory chenille bedspread in quick succession. Nearby, trays of accessories brim brilliantly with gemstones of every color imaginable. I tiptoe through the doorway to watch. Now Mommy inspects a dozen or so tubes of lipstick on her dressing table. Or a gal worth a grain of style without one. This little square-shaped petite carrying case was for one's makeup and toiletries, and you kept it with you, separate from the rest of your luggage. Pity you don't see them much anymore. Mommy added enamel compacts, rouges, foundation drams, atomizers, and big red pancake sponges in the Wedgwood blue case before snapping the shiny latches closed with precision. I edged closer to the shimmering gems on the bed. Without turning to see me, Mommy calls my name. Michelle, we don't have time for daydreaming today. Mommy grabs 4 or 5 different brass straightening combs, curling irons, and a portable hot comb oven from the top shelf of her closet. Now this is where she kept her special styling tools for Sarah's gigs. Go get dressed. You see, I'm ready to go. I don't plan on waiting on you, baby. I look up at my mother and she winks. She is in her uniform. Black cigarette leg pants, black mock turtleneck, and her trademark cat-eye glasses with rhinestones. She has dozens of pairs of those glasses, and I absolutely love them. Mommy had a way of looking effortlessly stunning and incredibly stern at the same time. Well, I run as fast as I can to my room. It's Sunday, but it's not like any other Sunday, no ma'am. I am wearing my beautiful pale pink organza dress with lots of layers underneath, so it stands out just so. You know what I mean. The dress is from Bamberger's, Newark's finest department store. I twist my little hips around to make the layers float as I slide my feet into my shiny new patent leather Buster Brown shoes. You weren't fashioned unless you had Buster Brown shoes. And I'll tell you, even then, I knew how to work a dress. Mommy puts her train cases down on the porch and smiles. Neighbors honk as they drive by. The entire block knows where we're going. Mommy grabs my hand and smiles. Today, I'm going with Mommy to New York. A long black Cadillac limo slowly drives down Avon Avenue toward our house. Kids ride behind the limo on their bikes, yelling. Everyone cheers. The limo stops right in front of the house. The chauffeur runs around to the passenger side and opens the door for us. You can imagine how special I feel. My grandmother kisses us goodbye, slips me a few peppermint candies as she always does, and beams with pride, whispering, "Be good, baby." "Tell Ed I said hello," she jokes. I was 5 before I ever knew Granny had a first name, but I would never ever call her Bessie. No, no, no. First names were for grown-up use only back then. Mommy and I climb into the waiting limo. The chauffeur smiles at us and says, "Next stop, CBS TV Studio 50, The Ed Sullivan Show." So get this, fur pelts, mink stoles, and fox wraps fly through the air and land on the ivory chenille bedspread in quick succession.
Good evening, everyone. In Force of Beauty, Mikki Taylor, editor-at-large of Essence magazine and longtime activist, introduces us to her gifted grandmother, Bessie, and her glamorous mother, Modena, and shares how Modena's friendship with the legendary Sarah Vaughan shaped Mikki's childhood. Mikki's mini memoir is a tribute to Newark in the 50s and 60s, cool jazz clubs and close-knit neighborhoods, a handsome house, and one family's tale of perseverance and ingenuity in a city they all loved. At a time when Black women were marginalized, disrespected, overlooked, and unseen, Bessie and Modena showed Mikki how beauty and style can be a force for good. Welcome, Mikki Taylor. Mikki, do you have your video on and your microphone? There you are.
There we are.
Hello,
So,
Mikki.
Hi there, Julia. How are you?
I am great, and I am thrilled to be talking to you.
Oh, likewise. Likewise.
We started with that bit about you at, how old were you, 5 years old?
5 years old.
On your way to the Ed Sullivan Show. So tell us a little more about how that night transpired.
So if you can imagine, I'm growing up watching the Ed Sullivan Show, probably before I could pronounce his name, but it was the most glamorous thing ever. And my mother, being hairstylist, makeup artist, and wardrobe stylist to the American icon that was Sarah Vaughan, to us, she was just as, we were on our way to the Ed Sullivan Show, and it was my very first time to go. And, I guess this is, you could say how my mother did take your daughter to work day. Sometimes we'd go to the airport to see her off and so forth. But that night was really special. I was dressed in my most fabulous little, organza dress. She was packing for sass as usual. And then the car pulls up to take us to New York City. And Sarah had been on Ed Sullivan many times. But this was a very special night. It was special for me, even because I got to go. I didn't have to watch it on the screen in the living room with my grandmother. And, I learned later how bold it was on the part of Ed Sullivan to have what was then known as colored acts on his show. And because advertisers threatened to pull their dollars from him, and especially by the time he shook Nat King Cole's hand on the show, that almost did it. And, I would hear all of these things. My mother's circle included Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, Lena Horne, and the like. But that night, Sarah there are no words for her performance that night in what couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 minutes. But, her multi octaves, the grandeur of that voice. And there, my mother had her in a vision. First of all, my mother arrived, she transformed the dressing room. Sarah was in a white brocade gown, like with a trumpet tulle bottom. And so the way my mother dressed her, and I really look back at that as I got older, my mother really paid attention to detail. So Sass was put together so fabulously that she didn't have to do anything else but sing. And so I understood later why she said, well, with Modena, I don't have to think about anything. All I have to do is sing. And that was the truth. But for me, there was another fascination to going to Ed Sullivan that night. On television, I noticed those shimmering curtains that would open when it was time for a performer to come on.
Yes.
And my mother was pressing Sass's hair. I slipped out of the dressing room unnoticed, at least for a little while. And I went for those curtains. And boy, I leapt on and I had to swing. And just before they were about to, I heard the band drumming up. And just before they were about to announce Sarah, a stagehand snatched me down. And my mother arrived at the same time with this glare in her eyes that I will never forget. Yes, so it was a very special night for Sarah, and it was a very special night for me until it wasn't.
You were swinging on the curtains. You were swinging with Sass.
Indeed, indeed. Mm-hmm. My mother was so silent on the way home in the car. And that was where when she finally did break her silence, and my mother's silence was like pregnant in the air. Me and my brother later on, we would say, just be mad at us. Let's just get this over with, because her silence was crippling. When she did break her silence, she taught me the first of many edicts. And she said, it's not what other people think of you. It's what you think of yourself that counts. And from age 5, that has stayed with me to this day. Mm-hmm. And when she broke her silence, that's all she said. She didn't say, I taught you better, you knew better, how could you? None of that. She just made that small pronouncement and left it with me to think about.
Well, full disclosure, everyone, Mikki and I go back, don't we, Mikki?
Yes, we do.
In the mid-90s, I was the associate fashion and beauty editor at Essence. And I wrote copy for the magazine's fashion and beauty pages. So I worked closely with Mikki. Mikki was the beauty editor and the covers editor, which meant she was in charge of the covers, those beautiful covers with models and celebrities. That was Mikki's area right there. So on any given day, I could go into Mikki's office. We were determining what we were going to cover, who we were going to interview, what things we were going to have. So in the beginning of that segment, the way she describes her mother's room with rouge and lipstick and all of that, Mikki's office was a version of that.
Yes.
Mikki's office was a version of that. So we're sitting there, and I think on this particular day, maybe we were talking about some vintage Black glamour, and we were talking about hair. So Mikki says, and when my mother did Sass's hair, and I looked up, and I love Sarah Vaughan's music, and I knew enough about Sarah Vaughan that her nickname is Sassy Sarah, and people call her Sass. So I said, did you say Sass? Mikki said, yes. And I said, Sarah Vaughan? And Mikki said, yes. Your mother did Sarah Vaughan's hair? Yes. And then she told me, not only did she do her hair, she did her wardrobe. She's Mikki's godmother. She bought the house that Mikki grew up in, all of these things. So I was like, wow, Mikki has stories. And as my work with her progressed, Mikki had a lot of stories. Mikki's not a name dropper, but these things would just come out in spurts. And just her telling it, it was like she was in that moment. She was very animated and exuberant about these stories. So I just wanted to let folks know about that. I saw that, I knew about your stories long ago, but I didn't know that story. And Mikki had such a point of view about beauty and Black beauty in particular. I suggested that in the beauty section, she start with a column, and you started doing a column.
Right.
And you talked about all the things you'd experienced and how you experienced beauty. So.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think my first column, that column was called Consider This.
Right.
That's where I really did, an expose, I guess, on just who we are, the truth of who we are, how we saw ourselves in the motherland, how beauty was, they tried to take that concept and how we saw ourselves away from us in this country and how we took it back and how we just defied, any categorization that they would make about us. I began to, because there was also a lot of reverse cultural appropriation, if you will, at that time. And I began to tell us, no, we weren't trying to mimic Caucasian people when we colored our hair, because we colored our hair in the motherland with the red clay and the white clay. And I talked about the tribes that did so and tied it all back to red lipstick. And again, my role was always to affirm, inform, and inspire us. Right. And getting at the truth certainly was my way of doing that, and then creating the celebration. And it was important. I mean, if you think about the magazine in the early days, Black women were still the invisible women in this country. And the magazine wasn't even getting the advertising pages that white magazines were getting. Yet, growing up in my mother's beauty salon in Newark, and even watching her circle before she became an entrepreneur, I understood how hard Black women worked for their dollars. I understood what beauty meant to us when we were creating products, because there were none for us in the stores. And so to me, on my watch, it was important to make sure that we understood the truth of who we are, but also to make sure that manufacturers didn't ignore us. So that was like an early advocacy for me, trying to just change the conversation.
This book is so fascinating because it's certainly about your story, but it's also about it's about your mother, Modena, and it's about Bessie, your grandmother, and your father.
Yes.
But it's also about the city of Newark. Mm-hmm. It's about the Black migration north. It's full of facts. How much did you know about Newark as a Newark native before doing this book? And what was surprising to you in your research? What did you learn?
Well, I learned a lot of things. I was so, many times it was emotional for me, especially in recording the book, because I knew the stories that my grandmother and my mother told me. I knew the things that I witnessed firsthand. I knew our community. Newark, as large as it was, and it was by the 60s, it was one of the majority Black cities in the country. But yet you had this feeling that you knew everyone. It was a village and everybody looked out for everyone. And so, but I was surprised to learn that my grandfather, Moses Boyd, had helped to build the streets of Newark. He worked for the Standard Vitrillistic Company, and I found his records. And that was surprising to me to learn. I knew he had helped to build 18th Avenue Pool where we would go and swim. But I didn't know that he had helped to build the streets also. I learned all the different places that my mother and my grandmother lived, and her sister after my grandmother was widowed. That I didn't know. I understood, protest was something that was brewing long before the rebellion, otherwise known as the riots. And that Tom Hayden, who would eventually become Jane Fonda's husband, had a lot to do with helping Black people to own their voice in the city of Newark in the face of injustice. So those were just a few of the things I learned. I learned actually what brought me to tears is that I knew that my grandmother walked from Newark to Montclair, which is over 20 miles each day to cook and clean for a white family. She was only earning $1 a day, but I didn't know that walk was 20 miles. Wow. And I had even more honor, if you will, for her when I think back at how that same money, and the money that she made sewing clothing for other people was how she sent my mother to Howard. My mother was the first in our family to go to college.
Mhm.
And so those were, wow, there were so many things I learned. But yeah, and finding the birth and the death records and visiting the cemeteries, like for my mother's siblings. My mother had 8 siblings, they all died from some form of pneumonia because of lack of heating, low wages. That's part of how the North engaged Black Southerners, if you will. And my grandmother were a son and daughter of sharecroppers, and they were lured north because of the labor wages, which was certainly better than what they were getting in the South, but not enough to support them. So,
You really brought that out. Like coming north was better, but it wasn't
right.
comfortable. It wasn't good.
No.
The conditions, they weren't like rural conditions, but they were raw and rugged in a very urban way, in a very industrial way. So people lived in lofts without heat. Your grandmother lost siblings too, and she lost several children. So that was really interesting to hear, because sometimes we just think people come north and they got it made, and you do a little hard work, but it's better than the South. But it was hard.
It was very hard. And my heart went out to her as a wife and a mother, because my grandfather died my mother's brother, Moses Jr. He only lived to be 4 months and 12 days old. So that I did not know. I found that out when I was searching records and went to the cemetery. But he died in February. My grandfather died 4 months later. So she not only had to endure the loss of her baby, but her husband as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. In that short span of time. And so she was left with 2 girls, my mother and her younger sister, Leola.
And about how old was your mother at that time when she suffered those losses?
My mother was...
not your mother, I'm sorry, your grandmother. How old was your grandmother at that time when she suffered those losses? She was a young woman.
That was 1930. So she was born in 1898.
Okay.
Yeah. 32 years.
Young.
Unthinkable. Young. In a new place, a new city, knowing no one really.
Right. So Mikki, describe the Newark you grew up in.
The Newark.
You're a baby boomer.
Yeah.
So that's, it's after World War II, and talk about that Newark.
Newark was a thriving, enchanting place to be. For me, I guess you could say my experience beyond the communities and the folks and the restaurant owners. Black folks were entrepreneurs in Newark. They owned restaurants, they owned clubs all over the city, from downtown to uptown, if you will. And just hardworking, industrial people making a way for generations that they might not meet, really. Diversity and inclusion was on lockdown in my neighborhood. There was the German candy store owners, Mr. and Mrs. Alt, my dentist, Dr. William Bloomingfeld, rather. He had his office across the street. Mrs. Stewart, who built several restaurants in Newark. That was my first experience with a soul food cafe. She opened this huge cafe right down the street. And I would walk down there and you get your little tray and your fried chicken and the neighborhood gossip as well. But it was really phenomenal. There was a grocery store that I could walk to and so forth and so on. But then there was my experience in that the folks that were in my mother's circle. So Sarah lived at 21 Avon Avenue. We lived at 26 Avon Avenue. Sarah bought the house across the street from her so my mother could be close. And so we lived on the first floor there. It was a 3-family home. And like I said in Force of Beauty, on any given day, if they were in town, it was nothing for me to get up and step over musicians, like, let's say, a Cannonball Adderley or his brother Nat Adderley, or you name it. Count Basie lived down in Red Bank.
Right.
And Newark was really a mecca. So as much as New York had Birdland, Newark had the Key Club, and they all came and performed at the Key Club. So it was a mecca for the arts. It was a mecca for music, all sorts of entertainment, if you will. And there were just no 2 days alike. I mean, our house was like Grand Central Station. People were always coming and going. And not only my mother's circle of friends, but the people who brought their wares to her for Sarah. So the furriers would come and lay their pelts out on our living room floor. And of course, they would always bring gifts from my grandmother, my mother. They would bring all these fancy spirits. And my grandmother, they knew she didn't drink brown juice, so to speak. So they would bring her Manischewitz. And when my mother was on the road, she would let me have some. So I felt very grown doing that. It tasted like some fancy grape Kool-Aid to me with a little bit of bite, if you will. But it was just an amazing experience. My grandmother's host of friends and the church ladies and the ladies in the card group. And you know, they would all come and sit and talk and, you know, bring food, turkeys and what have you. And so it was pretty fascinating for me to see us, as I knew us, empowered in every way imaginable.
Certainly.
So, which is why by the time the rebellion hit and the newspapers were telling these, you know, gross untruths, I was stunned. I was like, are you talking about my people, my Newark? You must be kidding me.
I want to get to that, but before I do, now your mother Modine had it going on. Modina, I'm sorry. She had it going on. She was smart, she was stylish, she was confident, she was empowered in ways that your grandmother could not be.
Right.
Because of the generational difference in what was going on. How did she, daughter of a former sharecropper, develop her sophistication, her fashion sense, and her knack for doing hair so well? Because she went on to own her own salon. So tell me about that.
So my mother and my grandmother lived by two edicts. One was that to be risk adverse is to be success adverse. You know, that's the courage by which my grandmother married at 16, and Moses was quite older than her. He was born in 1881, and to come up to Newark. The other one was, if the best is possible, then good is not enough. And she encouraged my mother to dream. My mother was very outgoing. When I look back at her high school yearbook, she graduated Central High in 1944. My mother was a part of this club and that club. And you know, she devoured magazines. And because my grandmother was such an amazing seamstress, my mother used to say that if she showed my grandmother something, a picture in Vogue in the morning, she had it on that night. And yeah, and so she just dreamt a world. My grandmother encouraged all of us to be whoever we desired to be, because she would say sometimes, I paid it all, so you all don't owe anything. And so there was no dream that we could have that was too big. It was all information. If we were willing to get the information and to do the work, own it, own it.
I want to remind our audience that you can find Force of Beauty exclusively at Audible. It's an Audible original. You can go to audible.com/Force of Beauty. It is also in the chat. And this also brings me to our first contest question for this evening. Mm-hmm. In the chat, you will find out the platform to log into our contest. So this is the first question. I'm going to ask the question. My co-host Daphne will put it in the chat. You can go on and play the game, and I'm going to continue to talk to Mikki. So this is the question. Newark natives Sarah Vaughan and Mikki Taylor made their marks in jazz and beauty, respectively. This Brick City daughter has made her mark in both, with a Grammy-nominated jazz vocal album and a cosmetics contract to boot. Who is she? I'll read it one more time. Newark natives Sarah Vaughan and Mikki Taylor made their marks in jazz and beauty, respectively. This Brick City daughter has made her mark in both, with a Grammy-nominated jazz vocal album and a cosmetics contract to boot. Who is she? So people can get on Kahoot and play this game, get your answers in, and you will win an Audible book of Force of Beauty. So we talked about your mother, your grandmother and your mother, Mikki. What made her and Sarah so tight? Talk a bit about their relationship.
Well, my mother and Sarah were schoolgirl friends. And so, you know, they hung out together. My mother would go over to visit Sarah at her parents' house. At that point, they lived on Brunswick Street, Ada and Jake Vaughn. They were active in the church. Sarah played piano in the church. And so they were schoolgirl friends and had a lot in common, with the exception of style, if you will, because Sass didn't really give, you know, two hoots about that. Sarah wanted to sing. And Sarah really wanted to sing secular music. And her parents, her father just wasn't having it. So she would even sneak out of the window at night to go try to sing in clubs. She would play hooky from school. And so one night, my mother and Sarah and a group of friends, they gave Sass a dare. They said, well, if you're really serious about this thing and you're really gonna make it, you gotta try out at the Apollo. And so they all chipped in their allowance and they gave Sarah the money to go to the Apollo, and she won that night. It was $10 was the win and something else. And, you know, the rest is history. So long story short, Sarah went off to sing and my mother went off to college. So when Sarah married George Treadwell, the media wasn't as kind to her. They would talk about, you know, how she dressed. You know, one night they said she had a hole in her skirt, or they called her handsome. And George, ever the marketing whiz, decided that he was going to change that. And he called my mother and hired my mother to be Sarah's hairstylist, makeup artist, wardrobe stylist, and gal Friday. So that meant my mother was booking hotels all over the room, singing to Sarah's writer, doing her hair, pulling the clothes, and doing her makeup. And George had Sass's teeth capped because she actually had buck teeth and she had a gap. My mother gave her this demean pixie cut, took all that voluminous hair and the pompadours and tossed them to the side, kept Sarah's natural hair, and gave her this pixie cut. In fact, long before, I think it was Audrey Hepburn had it in Roman Holiday. And what I think was so brilliant about that was because Sass was a sweater, but this way, this cut was so chic in that she could be on stage with both textures, if you will, and it would still be a look. And so, yeah, that friendship progressed. And Sarah, again, bought the house we lived in so my mother could be close and so that my mother could pack and they would hit the road. And, you know, that's what it was. And in fact, my mother would be gone for long periods of time when they traveled. I remember she went on the road first when I was 4 weeks old, and she didn't return until I was 4 months old.
Wow.
And so, you know, family was really important to both of them. So with the Vaughns across the street, you know, that was great for my grandmother. And then my mother also hired a woman who was, you know, we didn't call her a nanny in that day. She was aunt. Everyone was your auntie. So my auntie Wibby lived with us to keep my grandmother company.
Speaking of hitting the road, you know, your mother got to travel by steamliner, did you say?
Yeah, the SS Liberté. They traveled by ocean liner.
Ocean liner.
Yeah.
Yes, ocean liner. And your mother was in some rarefied spaces when segregation was, you know, when there was still segregation. How did she navigate? You talked about, tell us about how the figure she struck when she was at the airport.
Well, you know, I will always believe that my mother's, the way she carried herself and her positioning, especially as she would lead for those junkets, was an activism role in and of itself. She was dressed to the nines. I remember she had a favorite, it was a poplin car coat 3/4, double-breasted, and it had this immense raccoon collar. And she would always wear these little straight, what we call cigarette leg pants. And she carried this carpet bag. It was like a tapestry bag. And that's where she had the makeup and some of the things for Sass's hair. And then when they were traveling, particularly by ocean liner, she had about 9 pieces of luggage of her own, in addition to the steamer trunks for Sass. These were huge blue hard suitcases, and they had their own canvas zippered covers with her initials on them, MD. And me and my grandmother used to get a real kick out of it, because we knew that the onlookers who were trying to figure out who is this Black woman with the porter and all this luggage thought that she must have been a doctor with the initials MD. But that was one way she would leave for the airport, leave for the ocean liner, if you will. Later, when they started traveling by plane, she had a number of looks that she would wear over her working gear, if you will, the little cardigans, the cigarette leg pants, the smart flats, the rhinestone cat-eye glasses. She might have been in a cashmere coat with a badger fur trim, or, she had this amazing blonde mink stole that I love. The pelts were so thick. They weren't like those little skimpy brown ones that, a lot of the other ladies wore, but, she had her pick of the best, and she always dressed for the occasion. They were traveling, they were going to work, but she dressed for going to work. Mm-hmm. Because, it was a statement. It was important to her. One of the things she taught me is always show up ready. Long before folks started saying represent, Mommy said, show up ready. If this is who you are, your life should demonstrate it. So that's where I learned that. And that, just watching her, even though when we go to the airport, she would always cry. And I remember asking my grandmother one day, I was so naive. I said, well, if she is so sad, why does she go? Mm-hmm. Little did I know this was her work, and she was torn between the passion of doing her work and leaving me as an only child, as well as her mother, because my mother and grandmother were inseparable. Mm-hmm. They were very, very close. And and also just the length of time that she would be gone. If you think about she was gone anywhere from 6 weeks to 4 months, 6 months sometime at a time. That's a long time to be away.
Yes, that is a long time to be away, to leave a young mm-hmm. child. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to move on to our second contest question. I'll read the question. Mikki Taylor's mother, Modena Davis, and Sarah Vaughan were chums from high school. When the jazz legend's career skyrocketed, she purchased for Davis the house where Mikki grew up. You could say that the street's name hinted at Mikki's beauty destiny. What was it? I'll read it again. Mikki Taylor's mother, Modena Davis, and Sarah Vaughan were chums from high school. When the jazz legend's career skyrocketed, she purchased for Davis the house where Mikki grew up. You could say that the street's name hinted at Mikki's beauty destiny. What was it? Tell us a bit about your father, Charles Graves, Mikki, also known as Red Shirt Charlie. I love that. I love that.
Yeah, that was his name. And the reason he had the name Red Shirt Charlie is because when he really started working, he bought himself this red shirt and he wore it to death, as the friends would say. And so that's how he got the nickname Red Shirt Charlie. But my father, too, had a tough life. He left home at age 12. He was the son of a sharecropper who was the son of a former slave. My grandmother, she also had, my father had 6 sisters. He was an only boy. And part of the reason he left home is because he said he didn't want to be another mouth to feed when they were struggling to feed them anyway. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, Maggie, she also was the help, as it was known. And she would beg for the newspapers from the white family that she worked for. And she would plaster those papers as wallpaper in their homes. So that's how poor they were. And she would cook everything from chicken feet to turtle, you name it. And my father, one of the things he said to me that stuck with me, is that the minister, she so adored the minister that when he would come by for Sunday dinner, he would eat and she would feed him, out of respect, knowing that she didn't have enough to feed everybody. And Daddy said sometimes he would see the minister going down the road and with his food, with his dinner in his belly.
Mhm.
So yeah, Daddy left home at 12 and made his own way. And it was tough for a long time, dodging the youth house because he was supposed to be in school, working odd jobs. And he too made his way up north. He was born in Wakefield, Virginia, and made his way up north. And Daddy favored the racetrack. Daddy had a whole different circle of celebrity friends. Daddy had celebrity friends like Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas. We all remember Frank Lucas from American Gangster, the film with Denzel Washington. And it was so funny. I remember going to the premiere and Frank Lucas, by that time, he was in a wheelchair and he stopped me and he said, your daddy was a good man. But yeah, that was my daddy's life. And it was very interesting growing up in Newark. A lot of times he and my mother would be in the paper for totally different reasons, but that was my reality. And Daddy favored the night hour spots and he eventually became an entrepreneur. He owned several clubs in Newark, but that was his life and it was tough. But he made a choice, took the risk and came up north. And he actually met my mother through Sarah.
Right. He met her backstage.
Yeah, he met my mother backstage. And, Sarah was trying to stand in the way of that because she didn't think, she felt my mother was one of the good girls and Daddy was, he knew the street life. And I remember Daddy said he turned to Mommy and he asked Sarah, who is this fine young thing you have right here? And she said, this is Modena and she works for me. And he said, not anymore, she doesn't. And Sarah stood up between them and said, Mr. Redshirt, you cannot just do anything you want to do. What makes you think she wants to have anything to do with you? And Daddy said, everybody wants to go to heaven, baby. So that's how that romance started.
Love that. So Mikki, you grew up in a thriving community, a thriving Black community, as you've just described.
Right.
Talk a bit about the uprising in 1967 and tell a bit about where you were and what that meant for you. After that, I'm going to read our last contest question. And, or actually, let me do that now. I'll do the contest question now, and then you can talk about that uprising.
Okay.
So this is our final contest question. Along with, along with being Sarah Vaughan's stylist and later opening her own salon, Beauty a la carte, in Newark's bustling Clinton Avenue, Mikki's mother was a civic activist and campaigned for the city's first African-American mayor. Who was he? Along with being Sarah Vaughan's stylist and later opening her own salon, Beauty a la carte, in Newark's bustling Clinton Avenue, Mikki's mother was a civic activist and campaigned for the city's first African-American mayor. Who was he? Okay, Mikki, let's talk about that summer, that long, hot summer of 1967. You were at camp, right?
Yes, I was. I was at camp in what seemed a world away. It was probably about an hour, Branchburg, New Jersey. And it was a new experience for me. I loved it. My mother didn't want me to spend that summer, in the neighborhood. She wanted me to experience something different. So she took me downtown and registered me for this Y camp. And so here I am at camp. I'm calling my mother. Guess what I'm doing? I'm holding a snake and they have all kinds of goodies here. We drink bug juice, as they call it, and activities, and we live in cabins. And so it was a whole new experience for me. And then that Sunday, my fellow campers, I remember it so distinctly. They were standing in front of one of the cabins and they were all in this circle huddled. And I wanted to know what they were looking at. Had they found another animal? What was it? And I ran over and I was trying to push my way in. I was like, let me see. And I saw that they were reading newspapers, and the headlines were about Newark. They were saying that the people were rioting. There were women looting and stealing supplies and utensils and putting them in their baby carriage. And they were just, the people aren't safe for themselves. They're killing one another. And I'm like, who are they talking about? My Newark? My people? And I read where a Black cab driver had been pulled over by Newark police. And he was beaten so badly that he couldn't even walk into the precinct, that they had to drag him in. And word spread quickly through the city. And the people, my people, went down to the precinct to demand justice. And that's where everything went haywire. I think over 1,000 people lost their lives in the city that summer. Buildings were burned, stores were looted. My grandmother, my brother, who was 7 years old at the time, and my mother were sleeping under the bed because bullets were flying over their head and tanks were rolling down our streets. And I'm trying to figure out, police who? Who are they talking about? Calling us these names and saying that in the ghetto. That was the first time I'd heard that. I live in a ghetto. What is that? And I remember asking the counselor, no, demanding, because I never failed to use my voice. I remember demanding to call home. And finally she gave in, and I called and there was no answer. And I kept letting the phone ring. I was just as close to a panic attack as one could be at that point. And I remember I hung up and I called again. And finally my mother answered. And I said, I want to come home and join the fight. And she said no. And I was horrified because, first of all, this is my first time ever being away from my folks. And my mother said no. And I had to stay there and endure that. And not only endure that the parents were sending their kids the papers to see what the Negroes were doing in Newark, but to hear their whispers, to be the novelty as they looked at me like I was some other. And I remember when I did get to come back home, Martin Luther King Jr. said that riots are the voice of the unheard. And when I came back to Newark, it looked like a war zone. Windows busted out of all the projects and the single and multiple family dwellings, curtains blowing through the windows like some war documentary, glass in the streets. And I remember there was a hardware store around the corner, and the man who owned the store, he, charged unfair prices because he was in the middle of a Black neighborhood. And I remember his store was completely destroyed. And my basement windows were knocked out in my home, and it was never the same. And after that, people began to make the great exodus. So the shopkeepers and the people where we would go and buy penny candy and, pickles and potato chips and toys, all the things we loved, where we would go on Springfield Avenue and get our Buster Brown shoes, all the Jewish shopkeepers, everyone made the great exodus. And it was almost like a vote of condemnation for the city. And I thought about it. These are the people in my neighborhood who didn't even own their houses. When they swept their homes and mopped their porches, they would let the mop water run down on the street, and then they would clean the streets that they didn't own. Upstanding, noble people who them and nor their ancestors ever got receipts for their contributions were now being called out of their name and condemned. And it was It's still emotional for me to this day, because for Newark at that time, that was almost like BC and AD. It was just that drastic.
Certainly, certainly. So I encourage everyone to get this book. It's an Audible original. Now we're going to take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to turn it over to my lovely co-host, Daphne Pierre. Take it away, Daphne.
Hi, Mikki. How are you?
How are you, Daphne?
I'm great. I'm great. Well, welcome, and thank you again for joining us today. Your stories are amazing. I had a chance to listen to the book as well, and your storytelling was just phenomenal. I felt like I was there, as well as like Newark. Didn't realize the rich history that it is. So thank you for sharing that. So first question, we do have some questions that some people in the audience have asked. Starting with, this is Lisa Kaufman. She says she grew up reading Essence. She's wondering, what are you excited for in terms of Black beauty today?
I'm excited for the revolution. I mean, you know, to see us expressing our beauty, not only on the pages of Essence, but just throughout the culture. We have always been, but especially now, a force to be reckoned with. The fact that we can go in and buy over 50 shades of foundation from Rihanna at Sephora. I'm excited about that, because I know a time when I had to fight with manufacturers to at least get 12 shades that came anywhere near our skin tones. I'm excited for the Crown Act, and that I'm hopeful that I will see a day where our hair won't be political, that it just is, and how we express our diverse textures. I'm excited for our beauty and its celebration, all shades, shapes, and sizes. I'm excited about us at the table and laboratories and in, you know, and in marketing and in public relations and on advertising pages. I'm excited that I didn't have to hunt for the images that you see behind me. And so I really think that the revolution is just getting started. And I disagree with the late American singer who was so phenomenal, Gil Scott-Heron, who said the revolution will not be televised. Well, this one will. Yeah, this one will. So I'm very excited about the possibilities ahead. Technology is calling us to play, and we are having our say.
Awesome. And let's pay homage to your mom, because she actually is one of the pioneers in this. And then of course you, right? I'm actually paying homage to her today with the cat eyes and the turtleneck.
I love it. I love it.
But yeah, I concur with that. I think that today, especially with the way women, you know, people are paying for our beauty, right? And want to look like us. And so
that's right.
I'm
the
excited.
World over.
Yeah. The next question we have, you talk about our skin tone and our history. So this question comes from Sharon Parker. She wants to know, have you done your African genealogy? And if so, what part of Africa?
Yes, I'm from Nigeria. My ancestors are from Nigeria.
Nice.
Yep. And they were brought to these shores on my mother's side to Greenville, Kentucky. And on my father's side to Wakefield, Virginia.
Wow, that's awesome. Right. So in talking about standard, in your book, you mentioned that there can be no standard of beauty on your watch. What do you mean by that?
Yes, because, you know, long before my mother brought Essence magazine home, you know, she would bring European magazines home. But here in the States, I couldn't turn a page and find me. You know, it took many years before I could see model Joyce Walker or Naomi Sims or even Beverly Johnson. So there was a standard of beauty here in the US, blonde, blue-eyed, Eurocentric features. It did not include us in any way, shape, or form, unless even if you looked at it, even in commercial advertising, look how long it took them to address Aunt Jemima. So yeah, there was a standard of beauty in this country. It didn't include us. We were the invisible women. And on my watch, I was not having it. And I called people out about it. I remember sitting at the table with advertising and marketing people and just using my voice, because I know that if we don't use our voice, we have no chance at the win. There is no passion to be found in playing small. So when they invited me to press events, I was the lone Black woman in the room, but I also knew I had millions of Black readers behind me. And if I was going to represent them, I was certainly not going to misrepresent them by keeping silent in beauty rooms and in press conferences.
Well, I think I can speak on behalf of every Black woman. Thank you for being a champion for us in those rooms, in those spaces. So with that being said, that actually transitions us to my next question. What were some of the obstacles that Black women faced that we continue to face when shopping for cosmetics?
First of all, there's the lack of understanding as to how we perceive our beauty. That's the first thing. So if companies understood on the most basic level that our beauty is a celebration of self, that it is self-referential, that we don't just buy products, that we buy experiences that we want to own, that we want to know in how we express ourselves. If they certainly understood that, we wouldn't still have such a narrow category in product offerings. But on the other hand, it doesn't bother me as much now that they don't understand it, because we are doing it for ourselves. When I look at women like Tracy Ellis Ross, who's having a curl conversation in a line called Pattern, if I look at Taraji P. Henson, if I look at Gabrielle Union, if I look at Lisa Price, who is now a part of L'Oreal, and Lisa, I remember when she was creating products in her kitchen because they weren't available on the shelves. If I look at Melissa Butler and the Lip Bar, and the list goes on and on. It reminds me of Angela Davis, who said, I'm no longer accepting the things that I cannot change. I'm changing the things that I cannot accept. So it's a new day. If they don't get it, we do. And we understand, no one understands how deeply beauty is an emotional purchase for us than we ourselves.
Which leads to my next question. Because there's been reports, especially now in the time that we're in, women, we are burnt out, right? Having to carry different roles within our households during COVID. And with that burnout comes obviously the lack of keeping ourselves together, whether it be through doing our hair or makeup. What do you recommend that women do in this day and age to still maintain our beauty and to feel good about ourselves?
I think we have to know our value. Self-perception colors everything. And in this time, in fact, there are multiple pandemics. It's not just COVID. There's racial, there's economical, we are in the midst of multiple pandemics. But yet the celebration of self must go on. Spiritually, mentally, physically, we must create time for self. We must create time to express ourselves. It is really not for anyone, when you get right down to it, other than the woman that you behold in the mirror. And she is worth every bit of it. I always say to us that we should wake up every day excited to be ourselves. No one else should hold the key to that. No one else should hold the key to self-care. We have to realize that self-care is not an option or a luxury. It is a necessity, because we cannot give out of our lack. For so long, we've given out of our lack. And if COVID's taught us anything, we have to learn how to lovingly say no. Mm-hmm. We have to set boundaries for ourselves, because if this time has given us additional stressors, then we have to create more time for peace, restoration, and introspection. Right. So maybe now we're no longer running through the shower like a car wash because we got to run to the job. Maybe now we have time for those slow baths. And we're going to put a do not disturb sign on the door because this is time for self. Mm-hmm. Maybe we're going to take a bubble bath and the bubbles are going to rise so high, we're going to feel like a young girl again because we love it. We've got the candles and the music going. because the elders had rituals.
Mm.
Saturday night, the Saturday night bath, where do we think that came from? That came from the elders.
Yeah.
If we need time to meditate, maybe that means we got to rise up an hour before we have to homeschool now. But do it we must, because we're worth it. And in so teaching and so honoring ourselves, rather, we teach others how to honor us. So it's ever more critical that we do that.
I love that. Honor yourself to teach others how to honor you. That's great. Well, with that being said, we're going to honor the winners of our of our contest. The third place winner goes to Lady T.
And Lady T, if you would send your email address to panelist only so that we have you.
Our second place winner, as you see, is Lisa from California too. Congratulations. And our first place winner is LTL. So please, if you can drop your emails in the to all panelists, so you can receive your prizes. All right.
Hey, Mikki, I want to ask you this real quick. Judith Watson-Remy asks, what's your favorite Essence cover?
Oh my gosh, that's a tough question. That's a desert isle question, Judith. I don't have a favorite. That's like if somebody asked me if you went to a desert isle, what would you have to have? I wouldn't go because I'd have to pack. So I wouldn't get stranded because I'd have to pack. So my favorite Essence cover, that's tough. I don't have a favorite. I have multiples. I have the 8 women for our 25th anniversary with Hallie and Latifah. Oprah in the black and white spats owning the chair. Beyonce, gosh, Beyonce had 8 covers. So it's the one in the sheer gray. The Obamas, absolutely. 2008, that was the first family portrait. And I was honored to be able to direct that shoot at their home in Chicago. That certainly is a favorite, but it's tough. I'm too biased. I love them all.
Well, Mikki, thank you so much for joining us today. There's so many comments coming in. Everyone has enjoyed this conversation. It has been a force of beauty.
Oh, thank you, Julia. And congratulations to the winners. And what I say to us, please be the author of your own story, tell it and make it a page turner. Don't keep it to yourself. Thank you, Mikki. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you both.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.